The first time I died, it was not from illness or violence, but from exhaustion. The particular kind that seeps into your bones when you realize you have been living reactively rather than deliberately. I was 34, standing in the marble foyer of my sister's Georgetown townhouse during a fundraiser packed with donors and cameras, watching her glide between senators and lobbyists with effortless charm, her hand resting confidently on the arm of her husband, Senator Grant Holloway. He was young for his position, charismatic in that carefully moderated way that feels both sincere and calculated. A man whose speeches about integrity and reform drew standing ovations, even from those who knew better. I had once been the one he courted. I had once been the one he looked at as though I were a strategic alliance worth securing. But I hesitated. I told myself politics was too ruthless, too public, too compromising. I stepped aside. My sister Evelyn did not. She stepped forward with the precision of someone who understood that proximity to power was its own currency. I married Daniel Mercer instead, a constitutional law professor who believed fiercely in ethics, who valued principles over popularity, who thought the system could be corrected if only enough honest people remained inside it. He was brilliant, idealistic, and catastrophically naive. When allegations surfaced that Senator Holloway had quietly traded legislative favors for private investment advantages rooted through discreet intermediaries, Daniel became one of the legal scholars publicly calling for investigation. He believed he was defending democratic integrity. He did not understand that he was challenging a machine far larger than one ambitious senator. I saw the warning signs too late. The sudden scrutiny on his finances, the anonymous complaints questioning his academic conduct, the subtle professional isolation. By the time the car forced him off the narrow Virginia highway late one evening, it was already decided. The official reports cited mechanical failure. I attended the funeral with hands that would not stop trembling and watched my sister stand beside her husband, her expression appropriately somber, her eyes carefully avoiding mine. 3 months later, I received an encrypted email from an unknown sender containing fragments of internal communications messages that suggested Daniel's public criticism had triggered containment measures. Before I could bring them to federal authorities, before I could decide whether exposing the truth would cost more lives, my own heart betrayed me. Stress, the doctor would have said. Grief. Overexertion. But when darkness closed in, I felt something else beneath it. Unfinished intention. When I opened my eyes again, I was 24, seated at my childhood desk with a law school acceptance letter still fresh in my hands. Downstairs, my sister was laughing brightly while our mother gushed about Senator Holloway's interest in her. It was years before Daniel would die. Years before investigations. Years before the machine closed ranks. I sat very still, feeling 2 timelines settle inside me like layered blueprints. This time, hesitation would not masquerade as caution. This time, I would not stand on the moral sidelines while men in tailored suits shaped consequences in quiet rooms. Grant Holloway invited me to dinner the following week. In my first life, I declined politely, uncomfortable with the intensity of his focus, unsettled by the way he framed relationships in terms of mutual advantage rather than affection. This time I accepted, not because I intended to marry him, but because I wanted to observe him before Evelyn did. He spoke eloquently about public service, about reshaping economic policy, about transparency in governance. Yet beneath his rhetoric ran a current of ambition so concentrated it was almost tangible. He did not seek office to serve. He sought it to dominate outcomes. He assessed me as he spoke, evaluating not compatibility but utility. I recognized the look because I had once mistaken it for admiration. Evelyn noticed his interest immediately. She had always possessed a predator's instinct for opportunity. The moment she sensed my measured engagement, her curiosity sharpened into determination. Within weeks, she positioned herself as indispensable volunteering for his campaign initiatives, aligning her public persona with his reformist branding, studying policy briefs with sudden intensity. Grant admired adaptability. He mistook it for loyalty. I withdrew gradually, allowing their connection to solidify without resistance. She believed she had won something from me. In truth, I had redirected the board. Instead of marrying into proximity, I pursued access from another angle. I shifted my legal focus toward national security law and internal oversight mechanisms, The obscure but powerful frameworks that govern classified information, campaign finance compliance, and interagency accountability. It was not glamorous work. It required patience, discretion, and an ability to operate without recognition. I cultivated relationships inside oversight committees, within inspector general offices, inside the bureaucratic arteries where information flowed before becoming public knowledge. I did not chase headlines. I studied architecture. Evelyn married Grant in a ceremony broadcast across major networks, her vows polished, her smile radiant with triumph. She adapted seamlessly to the role of political spouse, poised, articulate, strategic. For several years she flourished. Grant's star rose rapidly. He secured influential committee assignments, shaped trade negotiations, and cultivated donors whose loyalty bordered on dependency. Publicly, their marriage appeared formidable. Privately, fractures formed along predictable lines. Grant compartmentalized everything: alliances, conversations, even affection. He trusted no one fully. Not even her. The first tremor of vulnerability emerged when a closed-door oversight review flagged irregularities in a legislative rider Grant had championed. It was subtle, an amendment benefiting a private consortium whose investors were strategically obscured. My office received preliminary findings months before journalists caught scent of anything unusual. I recognized the pattern instantly. It mirrored the communications I had once received before Daniel's death. This time, I was not a grieving widow scrambling for proof. I was inside the mechanism authorized to demand it. Evelyn called me one evening, her voice tight despite careful composure. She insisted the scrutiny was partisan theater, that Grant's opponents were manufacturing suspicion to derail his trajectory. I listened without correcting her. She asked, almost casually, whether my department had heard anything substantial. I responded truthfully but incompletely. There are always reviews. She exhaled in visible relief, mistaking neutrality for reassurance. As evidence accumulated, it became clear that Grant had not simply accepted questionable donations. He had orchestrated a network of legislative incentives designed to reward select investors while shielding transactions through layered intermediaries. It was sophisticated, legally ambiguous in isolation but damning in aggregate. I faced a choice I had not fully anticipated: recuse myself to preserve emotional distance, or remain and ensure the investigation proceeded without manipulation. In my first life, I had been sidelined by grief. In this one, I remained. Not out of vengeance, but because I understood how easily oversight can be softened when familiarity intervenes. When subpoenas were issued, the political landscape shifted violently. Commentators debated motive. Allies distanced themselves. Grant delivered defiant speeches proclaiming transparency while privately pressuring agencies to narrow their scope. Evelyn stood beside him publicly, unwavering. But in private she confronted him with questions he deflected with chilling calm. He did not confess. He rationalized. He framed ethical gray zones as strategic necessities. Watching from a measured distance, I saw something I had missed in my first life. He did not fear consequences because he believed consequences were negotiable. The decisive evidence surfaced through a classified memo linking financial beneficiaries of the legislative rider to shell entities that had quietly funded legal intimidation campaigns against academic critics, including Daniel in my first timeline. The symmetry was undeniable. I authorized escalation to a formal inquiry panel, fully aware that once initiated, the process could not be quietly dismantled. Grant requested a private conversation before hearings commenced. We met in a secure federal conference room, the air sterile and unadorned. He studied me with narrowed calculation, recognition dawning slowly. "You've positioned yourself well," he observed, tone almost admiring. I met his gaze evenly. "I positioned myself where the law functions," I replied. He smiled faintly, as though appreciating a worthy opponent. "Power," he said softly, "is rarely clean." I answered without hesitation. That's why it requires boundaries. The hearings that followed were methodical rather than theatrical. Evidence layered upon evidence until denial became implausible. Evelyn watched from the gallery during preliminary sessions, her composure cracking in imperceptible increments. For the first time in her life, proximity to power offered no protection. When formal charges were filed for corruption and obstruction, she did not look at him. She looked at me. not with hatred. With stunned comprehension. After his resignation became inevitable, she came to my office unannounced. The confidence that had once defined her posture had thinned into something fragile, but not entirely broken. "Did you plan this from the beginning?" she asked, voice stripped of performance. I considered the question carefully, aware that honesty now mattered more than triumph. "I planned never to be powerless in the face of corruption again," I said quietly. "The rest was consequence." Grant was convicted the following year. The ruling did not erase the past, but it altered the future. Daniel did not die in this timeline. Without targeted intimidation, he continued teaching, continuing his advocacy without fatal interference. I did not marry immediately. I did not rush toward romance to compensate for ambition. Instead, I allowed myself something unfamiliar in both lives, equilibrium earned rather than borrowed. Evelyn rebuilt her life outside the glare of political theater, chastened but not destroyed. She had married power believing it would guarantee security. She learned instead that power without principle corrodes from within. And I learned that rebirth is not about reclaiming a man or reversing envy. It is about repositioning yourself where choices have leverage and consequences are not optional. Power does not collapse loudly at first. It tightens. It constricts. It begins as a subtle shift in tone during closed-door meetings. As glances held a fraction too long between aides who suddenly understand that loyalty may soon become liability. In my first life, I had watched Senator Adrian Whitmore's fall from the outside, reduced to a spectator in the gallery while cameras swarmed the marble steps of the Capitol and reporters sharpened questions like blades. I remembered the day the ethics investigation broke, how Victoria had stood beside him in a crimson coat, chin high, performing composure while her knuckles whitened around his arm. I remembered the leaked emails, the offshore donors, the classified briefings shared too casually at private fundraisers. I remembered thinking that power built on secrets is only as strong as the silence protecting it. And in this second life, I chose not to stand in the gallery. I chose to stand where silence was manufactured. Marrying Julian Cross had not been impulsive. It had been inevitable once I understood the architecture beneath Washington's grandeur. Julian did not run for office. He did not give speeches or shake hands or appear beneath chandeliers at fundraising galas. He worked in the shadows of information consulting, compliance, strategic intelligence. The kind of man senators called when they needed a problem erased before it became public language. In my first life, I had underestimated the magnitude of his influence because it did not glitter. In this one, I sat across from him in quiet offices where phones were left outside and conversations were measured in implications rather than declarations. He never asked me about Victoria's marriage outright, but he understood the connection the moment her engagement to Adrian was announced. His gaze had lingered on mine just long enough to confirm that he knew I remembered something he did not. That unspoken awareness became the foundation of our partnership. Victoria, meanwhile, wore her new status like a coronation. The wedding was lavish but calculated, donors in attendance, cameras strategically placed, the kind of ceremony designed to signal inevitability. She believed she had ascended beyond rivalry, beyond comparison. In her mind, marrying a rising senator meant she had secured proximity to national influence, perhaps even the White House someday. She mistook proximity for protection. Adrian, charismatic and eloquent, thrived on momentum. His speeches stirred crowds. His policy proposals earned headlines. But beneath the rhetoric lay compromises he convinced himself were temporary. Offshore contributions rationalized as necessary. Private assurances given to corporate backers. Classified briefings discussed too loosely with those who had no clearance but abundant curiosity. In my first life, those compromises had surfaced one by one until they formed a noose. This time, I watched the rope being braided in real time. The first tremor came during a late summer oversight hearing when a junior analyst leaked a discrepancy in defense allocation funds. It was minor on paper, an accounting inconsistency buried within pages of budget amendments, but Julian's firm noticed before the press did. I was present the evening the internal report crossed his desk. He read it once, expression unreadable, then closed the file with deliberate calm. "It begins small," he murmured, not to me exactly, but into the space between us. He did not need to explain further. Power insulated by secrecy can survive rumor. It cannot survive documentation. Victoria called me days later, voice edged with irritation disguised as boredom. There's nothing to it. She insisted about the hearing. Opposition theatrics. I listened without correcting her. In my first life, I had tried to warn her when Adrian's shortcuts escalated. She had accused me of envy then, claimed I resented her assent. This time, I offered only neutral acknowledgement. Silence can be more unsettling than argument. I could almost hear her searching my tone for condescension and finding none. That unsettled her more than criticism ever had. Autumn sharpened the tension. Investigative journalists began connecting Thread's campaign finance irregularities, undisclosed meetings with defense contractors, policy shifts that conveniently aligned with donor interests. Adrian denied everything with the practiced confidence of a seasoned politician. But denial is not exoneration. Behind the scenes, subpoenas were drafted. Staff members resigned to pursue other opportunities. Each departure chipped at the illusion of control. Victoria doubled down on visibility, attending more events, giving interviews about civic responsibility, framing herself as the embodiment of supportive strength. She believed performance could stabilize reality. She had always believed that. The night the classified correspondence leaked, I knew before the news alert appeared on my phone. Julian had come home later than usual, his silence heavier than routine exhaustion. He poured a drink, sat across from me, and met my eyes with something that was not triumph, not even satisfaction, only inevitability. He shared restricted briefings with donors, he said evenly. Not directly, but enough. My pulse did not quicken. I had lived this once already. The difference now was not the outcome. It was my position within it. I was no longer the sister watching from the margins. I was the wife of the man whose firm had documented every misstep with clinical precision. The press conference was brutal. Adrian attempted defiance, citing political persecution. But the evidence was irrefutable. Emails timestamped. Financial trails mapped. Security logs corroborated. Victoria stood beside him again. But this time the crimson coat could not disguise the tremor in her posture. The cameras captured the exact moment confidence fractured, her gaze flickering toward him as if searching for assurance and finding none. I felt no surge of vindication watching it unfold. Only a quiet confirmation that memory, when respected, becomes armor. She came to see me 2 nights later. No entourage. No makeup carefully staged for photographs. Just exhaustion carved into familiar features. You knew, she said. And unlike before, there was no accusation in it, only dawning comprehension. I did not pretend ignorance. I remembered, I answered softly. Her breath caught at the repetition. Perhaps she finally understood that this was never about stealing her future. It was about choosing a different vantage point within it. What does Julian want? She asked eventually, voice thin. The question carried layers, bargaining, fear, calculation. I considered the truth carefully. Stability, I said. He always has. And stability in Washington often requires controlled sacrifice. Adrian would not be imprisoned. Men at his level rarely are. But resignation was imminent. Committee seats would be stripped, influence diluted. A career built on assent would plateau abruptly into irrelevance. For Victoria, who had equated status with identity, that was a more devastating sentence than any courtroom ruling. When the resignation letter was announced, it was framed as a step back to protect the integrity of the office. The phrasing was elegant. The implication brutal. Within weeks, donors distanced themselves. Invitations dwindled. The social circle that had once orbited Victoria shifted seamlessly to fresher prospects. Power abhors vacancy but detests scandal more. I attended a diplomatic reception shortly after, standing beside Julian as conversations flowed around us. No one mentioned Adrian directly. They did not need to. Influence had already recalibrated. Months later, Victoria filed for divorce. Not out of heartbreak, though there was some of that buried beneath ambition, but because she understood that proximity to fallen power offers no leverage. When she met me for lunch after the paperwork settled, she looked smaller somehow, as if stripped of the aura she once wore so effortlessly. You chose differently, she said quietly. It was not admiration. It was realization. Yes, I replied. I chose the foundation instead of the spotlight. She nodded, gaze drifting toward the window where the Capitol dome stood immaculate against the sky, unchanged by the scandals unfolding within its corridors. Power endures. Individuals rotate. Secrets resurface. What differs is who stands prepared when they do. In my first life, I had envied her ascent. In my second, I understood that controlling secrets is not about destruction. It is about leverage, timing, and the discipline to act only when inevitability aligns with necessity. She married the senator for power. I married the man who understood how fragile that power truly was. And when the silence protecting it finally broke, I was no longer beneath the falling pieces.